The plan came like something cold and exact, sliding into place. If she could not buy labor, she would grow it. Not as others did, letting nature and time do their slow work. She would compress time, organize birth, and tangle ownership with blood so tightly that escape became a kind of self-amputation. Her descendants would be her workforce, her proof against sale, her anchor against flight. The logic horrifies in the light. In the dark of Katherine's study, it seemed elegant. She began a journal, not a diary. Katherine did not waste pages on feeling. She called it her cultivation record, wrote it in a simple substitution cipher, and used the language of fields to hide the language of bodies. Children were seedlings, chosen men were rootstock, pregnancies were plantings. The pages grew diagrams, lattices of pairings and expected outcomes, as if she were breeding livestock. In essence, she was. Her first selection was Isaac, 24, born on the property, strong, even-tempered. She summoned him to the main house on a March evening. In the record, she wrote only, "First planting completed with rootstock 1, weather clear and mild." She called him again 3 weeks later, and again. In April, she wrote, "Initial cultivation successful. Anticipate harvest in December." Richard knew something was wrong by late May. Katherine stopped riding in the cool mornings. She ate alone, dismissed the servant who tended her. For a woman who prized presentation, the withdrawal was new. But certainty arrived in June, when he listened unseen in the library, while Katherine spoke with the midwife, Miriam Grayson, sharp-featured, discreet, crossing thresholds on both sides of the color line when life or death required it. "You're certain?" asked Mrs. Grayson. "Quite certain," Katherine replied. "I should think early December, and your husband passed in February." A pause thinned the air. "My late husband and I were intimate in January," Katherine said evenly, "shortly before his final illness." The midwife's voice did not bend to belief or disbelief. "We'll prepare." Richard pressed into the bookcase until the wood bit his shoulder. His father had not left his bed in January. Fever had emptied him out. There was no possibility of intimacy, which meant the child inside Katherine had been conceived after the funeral, and the father was someone over whom she held power. He watched. Isaac went to the main house after dark. Katherine's speech toward him was measured, not kind, but not the bark she used on others. In July, Richard had the truth, and it had a taste like metal. Isaac was the father. The child would be named for Jonathan and claimed as his. The lie would be layered across county record, church pew, and parlors that would not ask. While Katherine was in Waynesboro one afternoon, Richard broke a simple lock on her desk and found the small leather book. The cipher yielded in 3 days to his exact, frightened mind. What he read chilled him clean through. It was not an affair. It was architecture. Pairings planned for years, notes on strength, eyesight, temper, charts of expected births, calculations for a workforce bound by blood. He copied pages, hands shaking, knowing he'd finally gathered something that could tear the mask off her face. At dinner, Katherine asked softly if anyone had been in her study. Papers seemed disturbed. "No, ma'am," she watched him the way a cat watches under a door. "I keep certain documents locked for good reason. If trust is broken, I take serious action. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." And then she smiled without warmth and spoke of family loyalty and what scandal would do to his father's memory. That night, Richard burned his copies. He kept his watch, and he began to weaken. The illness announced itself as exhaustion, then a failure of appetite, then headaches that made numbers swim. By October, his limbs betrayed him. Katherine was solicitous. She cooked broths herself. She summoned Mrs. Grayson, who called it nervous exhaustion, perhaps consumption. Rest, fresh air, a tonic from Augusta. Tuberculosis often visits the sensitive, Katherine murmured, adjusting his pillows, and mentioned a cousin who had died young. But Richard had read about arsenic in that small library. He knew the slow, clean poison that unstitched a body from within. He knew what it looked like to be cleared away. He also knew he had no help. The house servants answered to one voice. The overseer kept to the fields. Stairs to the front door might as well have been a scaffold. In late November, he wrote through dizziness to his grandfather in Augusta, naming the plan, the cipher, the poisoning. He pressed the letter into the hand of a young house servant named Pearl, begging her to post it in town without a word, Pearl told. Katherine opened the letter in front of him and held it to the fire. "You are very ill, darling," she said, voice oiled with pity. "Fever loosens the mind. It's a mercy you won't suffer long." Richard died on December 3rd, 1847, 3 weeks shy of 17. A physician from Waynesboro wrote consumption on the paper and shook his head sadly at how quickly a youth can fade. Katherine wept black-gloved tears. 4 days later, she delivered a healthy son and named him Jonathan. She called him slightly premature, and questions, if they existed, were never asked aloud. Between 1848 and 1856, Thornhill rose as if a hand had set it upright. Cotton yields crept upward, debts eased. Those who visited rarely admired the order of things and the quiet efficiency of the mistress who preferred her own company. The cost was sealed inside the house and the quarters beyond the oaks. Katherine bore 4 more children by 1853, daughters Elelena, Abigail, and Margaret, and a son, Samuel, all attended by Miriam Grayson, who was now bound to the secret by money and proximity. Her services came with extra rooms and silence. Mrs. Grayson did more than catch Katherine's infants. When pregnancies appeared in the quarters that did not match Katherine's charts, they ended. Plant-based compounds in a small back room behind the overseer's cottage. Whispered recoveries called miscarriages. Women carried grief beneath their ribs and did not name it because naming did nothing. Ruth tried to stand against it in 1851, 5 months along with a child made with a young man she loved, Samuel. She ran. Dogs dragged her back 4 miles later. The procedure was forced. Ruth lived in the narrow sense and died 2 years after, emptied by fever and something that would not heal. By 1856, 7 of Katherine's own children moved through the main house, neither family nor servants as the world understood those words. They were enslaved in the law, registered as children born to enslaved women on the property. In practice, they wore good cloth, ate better food, and learned to read in a house where a book in the wrong hands was a crime. Jonathan, 8, bore his mother's face like a mirror. Isaac, his father, was sold away in 1849 to Alabama, a problem removed and a debt lightened. The younger ones were told they were fortunate orphans preserved by charity. Katherine recorded their inches and illnesses with the same care she gave to ledgers, penciling futures in a locked room. She kept choosing men: strength, good teeth, clear eyes, no limp. Character did not matter. It was not a trait she meant to breed. A man named Thomas refused in 1855. He had a wife in the quarters, Hannah, and a baby coming. The overseer then, Virgil Kane, stripped Thomas in front of everyone and laid on 39 lashes until his back was a map of raised lines. Then they brought him to the main house anyway. He went silent afterward. Hannah did not ask. Some words poison the mouth that says them. By that year, Thornhill looked to a stranger like an ordinary plantation, fields of cotton and corn. 20 adults bent to the rhythm of work. 3 women and 1 elderly man in the house. And those other children who did not belong anywhere cleanly. 10 by 1856. Moving between piano and primer and a door that would not open to the yard unless Katherine said so. People in the quarters saw everything the way people always do, without the official language that would come later, but with perfect comprehension. They saw the measuring, they saw the locked book, they understood the waiting. The isolation did the rest. The rough road into Waynesboro turned to red soup in winter. Neighbors were distant and discreet. Katherine kept Sundays in her pew and gatherings to a minimum. Ambrose Talbert handled papers and did not ask questions because the account balances were improving, and improvement is its own argument when you have clients to keep. The horror could live inside a whitewashed house if everyone outside benefited from not seeing it. Change was already pushing at the edges in the late 1850s, though Katherine barely looked up from her pages. Kansas burned. A presidency changed hands. Words like secession were said at tables where children could hear. By 1859, Jonathan was 11, Elelena 10, Abigail 9, nearing the age at which a design becomes a machine. Katherine prepared for the next phase by drawing the future into a room and giving it shelves. She called it the Heritage Room. Windowless, oil-lit, journals coded and stacked, glass vials labeled with names and dates, locks of hair laid into rows by generation, family trees inked on paper mapped not by what had been, but by what would be. Eleanor to Marcus, Isaac's son to be born 1862, Margaret to Peter. Notes: strong constitution, compliant temperament, a shrine to control. In that room, Katherine believed she had solved a problem that had haunted the economics of her world. A labor force that could not leave, that cost nothing to acquire, that multiplied on schedule. And she believed they would love her for it in time, because she fed them and taught them and kept them near. It is the kind of belief that needs no truth to live. By 1860, the air itself seemed taut, as though the land were waiting to exhale. Beyond Thornhill's gates, the world tilted toward war, but inside the house, the real siege had already begun. Katherine's children were growing into what she had designed them to be, an obedient, interwoven brood, each one destined to repeat the pattern she had drawn in her journals. The oldest, Jonathan, was nearly 12 now. His sister, Elelena, 10, watched her mother the way a trapped animal studies its cage, seeing every hinge, every key. That year, Katherine finished the Heritage Room, her sanctuary of control. Shelves lined with her coded volumes, glass vials marked with names and dates, locks of hair arranged by generation. The air smelled of oil and dust and something faintly metallic. She called it her record of progress, though there was no one to show it to. Each night she entered, recorded new measurements, drew new lines connecting the names of children who did not yet exist. The estate was quiet, but not still. In the quarters, whispers had begun to move, small as breath. People understood that nothing about Thornhill was ordinary. They had seen the pattern of Katherine's choosing, seen her study the children's faces as if reading scripture, seen the ledger she never let anyone touch. They did not have words for genetics or eugenics, but they knew she was growing something unholy, and that one day it would demand an answer. The first tremors came not from God or conscience, but from history. Lincoln's election in 1860, South Carolina's defiance, Georgia's vote to follow. By the spring of 1861, the country was cracking open, and men in Burke County were already marching east. Katherine said little of it. She had no interest in the outside world. The only territory that mattered to her was fenced in by oaks and moss. When war finally touched Thornhill, it arrived not with cannon fire but with absence. The overseer, Virgil Kane, enlisted and was killed at Shiloh. His replacement, Silas Kendrick, was old and half-blind. He could no longer enforce the terror on which the estate depended. Discipline frayed. The enslaved people began to hear rumors, Union victories, proclamations of freedom whispered from plantation to plantation like a prayer half-believed. Katherine responded as she always had, with control. She forbade travel beyond the property. She increased rations slightly to dampen restlessness. And most of all, she advanced her breeding schedule. Jonathan turned 15 that winter, and Katherine declared him ready. She chose a young woman from the quarters, Rachel, 16, daughter of a field hand, and arranged a small ceremony in the parlor. Candles, white cloth, a Bible she barely opened. She called it marriage. Jonathan did not question. He had been raised in isolation, taught that Katherine's will was natural law. Rachel stood silent, eyes down, her body shaking with the knowledge of what the word wife meant here. Afterward, the quarters understood that the next phase had begun. Katherine's special children, the ones she had bred herself, were now being paired with the others. It was the completion of her design and the signal that something inside the enslaved community began to harden into resolve. By the summer of 1863, the war was devouring everything except Thornhill's quiet tyranny. Confederate soldiers passed through, hollow-eyed and hungry. News traveled even faster than soldiers could march. Gettysburg, Vicksburg, defeat. Hope followed those words like a ghost, thin but alive. And inside the main house, a different kind of rebellion was awakening. It began when Elena, now 14, found one of Katherine's journals. Her mother had left it unlocked, careless in her confidence. Eleanor had grown up surrounded by whispers, servants glancing away, hushed arguments behind doors, but nothing prepared her for what the cipher revealed. She deciphered it slowly, piece by piece, as if unearthing bones. Second planting with rootstock 2. Thomas, age 21. Excellent specimen, weather warm and humid. Anticipate harvest in late October 1848. Thomas. She knew that name. A field hand with quiet eyes and scars across his back. The man she passed sometimes near the smokehouse, who looked away when she looked toward him. Her father. Her mother was her owner. The truth struck like a physical blow. She read on, unable to stop. Charts of planned pairings, notes about strength, obedience, skin tone, a map of lives arranged without consent. Then she saw her own name connected to another, Marcus, Isaac's son, to be born 1862. Pairing with Eleanor, anticipated 1865. She was being prepared like breeding stock. When she confronted Katherine that night, the air in the parlor froze. "I read your journal," Eleanor said. "I know what I am." Katherine's face hardened, the calm mask of someone accustomed to command. "Sit down. Number. Sit down." Eleanor sat, trembling. Katherine began to pace, her voice measured, almost patient. "You are my blood," she said. "You are my legacy. Everything I have done has been to preserve this family. You mistake necessity for cruelty. You bred us like cattle. I gave you life when others would have sold you to strangers. I gave you food, shelter, education. What would you be without me? Dead in the fields by 12. You will do your duty. Eleanor's voice broke. I won't. Then you will be sold. That word landed like a door slamming. Katherine leaned close, her whisper colder than any shout. Do you know what happens to girls who defy their owners? They vanish into the deep south and are never seen again. You will stay here, where you belong. Eleanor said nothing, but she understood the shape of her mother's fear. She had power only as long as silence held, and so Eleanor broke it, quietly, carefully. She told Jonathan first, showing him the pages she had copied. He read, frowning, but the horror did not reach him. He had been too well trained. She saved us, he said softly. We could have been in the fields. We're safe here. We're slaves here, Eleanor answered. Jonathan looked away, but Abigail listened, and Margaret listened. The younger children did not understand, yet they sensed something shifting. The house grew tense, eyes flickering, words guarded. Katherine felt it before she knew it. In August, Grace ran. 17, pregnant, desperate. She made it almost to the river before the dogs found her. The next morning, Katherine gathered everyone between the quarters and the big house. This woman tried to destroy the family we have built, she said. The punishment must be seen. 20 lashes fell. Children watched. Eleanor watched. The sound of leather against skin echoed through the trees. It was meant as a lesson in fear, but what grew instead was recognition. Katherine feared them more than they feared her. That night, in the cabins, whispers turned to plans. They spoke of the Yankees, of freedom creeping south with every mile of Sherman's march. They spoke of endurance, of waiting for the right moment. Eleanor began visiting the quarters when Katherine slept, listening more than speaking. She learned what had been done to Ruth, to Thomas, to the women who had carried and lost children by force. She learned that hatred could be patient. One night in October, she met a small group of women beyond the oaks. Hope was there, a broad-shouldered woman with eyes that had seen everything. They sat in a circle, voices barely above the crickets. Your mama thinks she built a family, Hope said, but all she built is hate that knows her face. Eleanor asked, what happens when the war ends? Hope shrugged. Depends who wins. But even if the South wins, your mama's time is near done. Too many want her gone. What if we don't wait? Eleanor whispered. What if we make it end ourselves? The question hung in the dark. Anna, the youngest of them, spoke softly. You mean fight? There's only her and old Mr. Kendrick, Hope said. But where would we go? You think the world outside wants us? You think they'll see you as one of us? The question cut. Eleanor's skin was lighter. Her words were not theirs yet. They never finished the conversation. Footsteps cracked through the brush. They scattered into the trees, hearts hammering. Katherine never learned what was said that night, but she felt the shift. The air itself had changed, thick and electric. She set Kendrick to patrol, doubled the locks, restricted movement further. Thornhill was a fuse waiting for its spark. That spark came in March of 1864. A Confederate cavalry unit stopped overnight, demanding food, horses, cloth. They spoke freely around the quarters, grumbling about Sherman's advance, about the war being lost. Hope listened. Others listened. The word freedom began to sound real. For the first time, people at Thornhill allowed themselves to imagine a world after Katherine. Katherine imagined no such thing. If the Confederacy fell, her entire creation would collapse. Her children, her experiments, her vision of eternal ownership, it would all dissolve the moment emancipation reached Burke County. She made her decision in silence. On the night of March 17th, she gathered her 11 children in the main house. "War is coming here soon," she said. "The Yankees will destroy everything. They will take you from me. I will not let that happen." Eleanor felt the chill even before she saw the small wooden box. Inside were glass bottles filled with a clear liquid. "It's medicine," Katherine said. "Laudanum. In small amounts, it soothes pain. In larger amounts, it brings peace. Eternal peace." "You mean to kill us?" Abigail breathed. "I mean to protect you. Out there you are nothing. Too white for one world, too black for the other. Here you are family. Here you are safe." "No," Eleanor said. "Anything is better than this. You're too young to understand. I am your mother." She reached for the bottles, but Jonathan stepped between them. "Number. Jonathan, move aside. I've read your journals," he said quietly. "I know what you did. I know what you made us. I am your mother. You're a monster." The slap cracked through the room like gunfire. "How dare you? After all I've given you. After what I've built." "You built nothing," Eleanor said. "You destroyed us." Katherine looked at her children and saw for the first time that they were no longer hers. Their faces mirrored the features she had once admired in herself, but the eyes were cold, unyielding. She turned away, snatched up her journals, her vials, her charts, the evidence of her genius, her curse, and fled. Jonathan and Eleanor ran after her, but she was already out the door, crossing the yard toward the quarters, calling incoherently about her legacy, her proof. What happened next depends on who told it. But every version agrees on one thing: that the people in the quarters saw her coming and knew the night had arrived. Katherine Thornhill disappeared. Her papers were found scattered in mud, her charts burned, the vials shattered, and the woman who had ruled Thornhill for 16 years simply ceased to be. When Jonathan and Eleanor reached the quarters, Hope stood waiting. "Where is she?" Jonathan asked. "Gone," Hope said. "That's all you need to know. She's gone and she ain't coming back. What did you do? What had to be done? Now you got a choice, boy. You can cry for her, or you can let justice rest." Eleanor met his eyes and whispered, "Let it rest." The next morning, the overseer reported the mistress missing. The sheriff came, looked around, wrote his theories, fled the war perhaps. No one in the quarters said otherwise. No one ever would. The record ends there. March 17th, 1864. The woman who bred her own blood into bondage vanished into her own soil. The war ended as if the earth itself had sighed. Sherman's army carved a path through Georgia that never touched Burke County directly, yet its echoes reached every acre. By April 1865, the Confederacy was dust. Freedom, slow, imperfect, staggering, moved like dawn through the ruins. At Thornhill Estate, what remained was neither victory nor relief, but confusion. The plantation's mistress was gone, and her house, stripped of purpose, stood like a mausoleum. The law no longer recognized ownership of human beings, but the law had not yet learned what to do with the aftermath of that ownership. Jonathan, at 17, was the eldest of Katherine's children, and by her records, the rightful heir. But those same records also marked him as enslaved. He was both inheritor and property, son and asset. His very existence a contradiction no court could untangle. Lawyer Talbert in Waynesboro tried. He examined the papers, the ledgers, the surviving journal pages, half burned and half decipherable. In the end, he shrugged and filed the estate under unresolved. Most of the people who had worked Thornhill left within weeks. They scattered across Georgia, following rumors of family long sold away, searching for wages, or simply for the first horizon they had ever been allowed to choose. Some went north. Some never made it out of Burke County. A few stayed, at least for a time. Hope remained, organizing the first fragile attempt at freedom's shape, a community built from what had survived. Thomas stayed too, quieter now, shoulders still scarred. The man who had once been called Rootstock Number 2. He stayed because Eleanor asked him to, because she needed to understand something she could never quite name. Their first conversation as father and daughter was not about love or forgiveness. It was about truth, bare, dry, almost unendurable. She asked if he had known. He said yes, and then neither of them spoke of it again. Some truths cannot be carried in words. They exist only in the silence that follows them. Eleanor stayed until 1867. In those 2 years, she learned the taste of decision, the way freedom felt like both air and weight. She planted a small garden where the quarters had been, tended it herself, and never once stepped inside the main house again. When she left for Savannah, she carried nothing from Thornhill except the ache that had shaped her life. She became a seamstress, married a carpenter named William Foster, and never bore children. She never spoke of her mother. When she died in 1903, her obituary called her a quiet and respected woman. It mentioned nothing of where she was born. Jonathan lingered longer. He tried to work the soil, to make it yield something that wasn't haunted. But the ground refused him. The cotton market collapsed, the red clay exhausted. The property's name whispered with unease among freedmen who knew what had happened there. By 1869, he walked away and never looked back. In Texas, under another name, he lived and died without telling anyone who he was. In his few belongings, found after his death in 1891, was a small notebook. Every page contained the same line written over and over in cramped script. I did not choose this. Thornhill did what ruins do. It decayed. A fire in 1871 half consumed the main house, and by the time the county seized it for unpaid taxes 7 years later, only the foundation and a few stubborn walls remained. A timber company bought the land, cleared the trees, and divided it into parcels. But the past resists burial. That same year, 1871, a well driller broke through into a forgotten cistern on what had been Thornhill land. Inside, 30 feet below the surface, they found a skeleton. The bones were mostly intact, the dress scraps recognizable as mid-century. A corroded locket lay nearby, holding 2 miniature portraits, a man and a young boy. The coroner noted blunt force trauma to the skull. In the county ledger, the entry is brief. Unknown female, discovered former Thornhill property, 1871. But Burke County's black community did not need the coroner's guess. They already knew whose bones those were. The story had never died. It had been whispered for decades. In kitchens, in church pews, in the quiet moments when elders taught the young which ghosts belonged to which piece of ground. They said she'd been thrown down the well after the last cry left her throat, that the earth had taken her in silence, that it was justice, the only kind the law could not undo. Time folded. In 1889, a dying man in Alabama confessed to a minister that he had helped kill his former mistress in Georgia during the war. He gave no names. The minister wrote it down and moved on. In 1902, a woman in Savannah, Hope's granddaughter, wrote a short memoir, unpublished, calling it "The Night the Devil Mistress Disappeared." Then, in 1923, a historian combing courthouse basements for Civil War records found a letter written in 1865 by Captain Samuel Reynolds of the Union Army. He wrote of arriving at a property called Thornhill Estate. He described evidence of systematic breeding experiments upon enslaved persons, including the owner's own offspring. He wrote that the details were too grotesque for record, and that witnesses told him the mistress had met a justice not delivered by law. Reynolds closed his letter with a single line: "What was done to her was deserved, and I will not trouble the dead by inquiring further." The letter was forgotten again, misfiled in the archives, until a graduate student rediscovered it in 1954. She tried to trace the story, interviewing the oldest residents of Burke County. Most said they knew nothing. One woman, 93 years old, said only, "Some things happened that needed to happen. Some people did things that needed doing." And then there were the children, the 23 discovered in the basement by Union soldiers in 1864. Captain Reynolds mentioned them briefly in his report. Letters from soldiers in his unit confirmed it. A locked cellar, iron doors, the sound of children too quiet to be found at first. They were freed and placed with families among the newly emancipated. After that, the record ends. Their names vanished into marriage rolls, census lists, or nowhere at all. But blood endures. Somewhere in Georgia or beyond, there are people who carry the ghost of those green eyes, that amber-threaded hair. People who never knew that their existence began in the shadow of a woman who thought she could outbreed morality. Today, Thornhill Estate is a field of pine and kudzu. No plaque, no marker, just uneven earth where foundations once stood. The well has caved in. The woods have reclaimed the road. But in Burke County, if you ask softly enough, someone will still tell you that the land remembers. That in high summer, when the air hums and the ground sweats with heat, you can hear children singing under their breath, somewhere deep where the roots still run. The story of Thornhill is not just about one woman's cruelty. It is about the machinery she built inside a system that made such cruelty possible. A society that could look at human beings and see profit, that could measure worth in flesh, that could call bloodline property. Katherine Thornhill did not invent that logic. She only followed it to its final, perfect horror. And in the end, it consumed her. The woman who wanted to leave a legacy was swallowed by it. The people she sought to control wrote the last chapter with silence and with shovels. There is no monument to any of them, not to the mistress, not to the enslaved, not to the children born of that nightmare. Only the earth and the story that will not stay buried. If you're still listening, ask yourself, how many other Thornhills still lie beneath the soil, unnamed and unmarked? How many other counties have their own silence disguised as history? The past never really dies. It waits. And sometimes, if you're very quiet, it tells you its name.